Hello and welcome to this edition of A Conversation With. I'm Jim Marshall of the New Bedford Cable Network, and joining us today, once again, another update. Brian Glynn Williams, professor at UMass Dartmouth, is with us. Brian, thanks for coming in and chatting with us again. Lots obviously happening. Your head must be spinning really when you think about this. It's been 2 years since the attack on Israel, and it just every day brings something new.
Yeah, it's been a momentous 2 years, we might add. You know, that it was 2 years ago on October 7th that these Hamas terrorists changed the course of history by breaking over those walls, the Iron Wall, they called it, and going on this rampage that led to this war that has lasted 2 years and cost, about 68,000 Palestinians their lives. So it's about time that this bloody meat grinder in Gaza has come to a halt. And I think it's interesting to find out what will happen with Trump's ambitious 20-point peace plan.
And of course, we've been talking to Brian before that because of the war in Ukraine, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So recently, Brian, this week here, as we're talking here, the peace agreement came about last week. It was signed, and now it is being, for lack of a better word, implemented as best as it can right now. We can talk about the 20-point plan in a second, but I want to talk about first what finally prompted the peace deal to come about. There's been so much talk. I know that the U.S. has been previously, there was another plan that was talked about in April, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and nothing ever happened with this. So what finally happened now that turned the tide that, in a sense, kind of prompted Israel, we're going to have to make a deal now?
It was a confluence, a convergence of several events. One was Israel was increasingly getting isolated. You may recall at the end of summer and September, countries like Britain, Australia, Canada, France came out and decided to recognize the state of Israel. And this is a huge
state
event.
Of Palestine.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
To recognize the state of Palestine. This is a huge event because, the British had been strong supporters of Israel. And when they came out under Keir Starmer, prime minister, and recognized the state of Palestine, this began putting Netanyahu in a corner. He's becoming more and more of a pariah state. And of course, in September, Netanyahu acted again and launched a missile strike on a Hamas peace delegation in Doha, Qatar. This was a huge break of protocol and norms. The Israeli strike didn't kill these Hamas peace leaders, but it infuriated Donald Trump, who didn't know about it and considers Qatar to be a key American ally. And it further isolated Netanyahu. And I think Trump saw his moment. These Nobel Prize award was being announced. He saw Netanyahu as more isolated than he'd ever been in history. And he decided, Trump did, to strong-arm Netanyahu and bring him to the peace table and to make this treaty, this peace deal with Hamas that he'd been pushing ever since he came to office. Trump has made it clear that he wants the Nobel Peace Prize, and this was his big moment to push Netanyahu into finally ending hostilities and declaring a ceasefire with Hamas.
There were those, though, in the cabinet, the Israeli cabinet, the hard right side, who didn't want the peace deal. They still wanted to go in and eliminate Hamas permanently. And it seems there's still turmoil, I guess, in the cabinet, the Israeli cabinet, but Netanyahu still went ahead with the peace deal. I guess, and obviously I don't know what he's thinking, but you're looking at it, the isolation was too much for Israel versus the hardliners' approach of eliminating Hamas.
Yes, as you mentioned, Jim, the government in Israel today is the most right-wing, ultra-Orthodox, militant government in Israeli history. Benjamin Netanyahu has made a deal with these hardcore, pro-settler, Orthodox Hasidic parties, including groups led by really fanatical Orthodox leaders like Itamar Ben-Gvir, and they have held him hostage. They've made him move to the right, and they, as you mentioned, they did not want Israel to make this peace treaty with Hamas, but they did it. I think it was in part because Benjamin Netanyahu was sort of linked to Trump. And the last thing he wanted to do is annoy and anger his main benefactor, Donald Trump. So when Trump came out strongly and said, we have to have a sit down with Hamas, Netanyahu finally broke with these right wing Orthodox party in his coalition and chose to buck their power and meet with Hamas for this historic moment.
But is it possible that Israel, the Israelis and Netanyahu in particular, as you said, they were being isolated, that the isolationism was too much too, or could have been too much, because Israel couldn't do it alone ultimately for a long period of time. They need their allies.
Oh, yes. I mean, America is key to Israel. I mean, if it wasn't for American support, they couldn't have maintained this war effort. We were the ones providing them with those bunker buster bombs and intel and all sorts of ammunition and finances. We financed and militarily supplied that war effort. So they can't say no, especially to Trump. Trump has been a strong supporter of Israel. And when he came out and finally said, enough is enough, this resonated also with Israelis. A poll taken in September showed that 85% of Israelis supported the idea of peace. So I think both sides, both the Israelis and the Palestinians in Gaza, had been dragged down by this war, and both sides had war fatigue and finally wanted a ceasefire.
I think the Israeli people certainly wanted peace. At least that seemed clear too. And they're obviously, again, we have to remember that it was Hamas that attacked Israel and killed 1,200 people on October 7th, 2 years ago. So that's what started this whole thing. And obviously, as you mentioned earlier, 67,000 Palestinians roughly killed in response to that. Talk about the deal, though, that was signed. As far as talk a little bit about the points. I mean, there's 20 points in there and what have you. It's a 3-phase peace deal. There are some things, obviously the hostages, 20 hostages, living hostages now have been released, and they are continuing to release, I guess, 2 more bodies released today. But Hamas has said today, that I've read, as we're recording the show, Hamas is saying that they're having a difficult time finding the other bodies. How much is that going to play a part in keep holding the peace deal together?
The devil is in the details. And one of the first key, most important factors, in this early phase 1 period was that Hamas would release these 20 surviving hostages and 28 bodies of the hostages. Now they've released the living hostages, and this was cause for a huge celebration in Israel. And Trump spoke to the Israeli Knesset, the parliament, and was greeted like a conquering liberator.
Oh, he was cheered, and Netanyahu was booed.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah, in the parliament.
Yeah, a lot of people in the parliament obviously aren't fans of Netanyahu. He dragged this war on longer than he should have, according to people who were thinking first and foremost about getting those hostages out. And credit where credit is due, Trump did arrange to have the hostages released, and he was really treated with cheers and respect and applaud in the Knesset. But the other bodies, they're hard to find. Some of them, it sounds like, were crushed by Israeli bombardments, and these bodies of Israeli hostages that were killed, possibly even by Israeli airstrikes or artillery strikes.
I was going to say, for lack of a better word, friendly fire could have killed them.
Right. Sadly, friendly fire from Israel could have killed some of these hostages in that war-battered death zone. So, this ceasefire is fraught and it is fragile. Either side could blow this deal, and certainly we don't have a long-term, peace plan, real framework yet. The devil lies in details, and we'll see whether or not the underlying factors, such as Israel's right to demand security, are met, and whether or not the Palestinians, who demand to have their own self-determination, their own state, whether or not their demands will be met.
One of the things, too, that I read is that Israel could send crews in that could help look for the missing bodies, cadaver dogs, and what have you, because obviously, apparently, Gaza, Hamas doesn't have them. So, I mean, a logical person, if you take the emotion out, a logical person could say, well, that makes sense that it may be hard to find some of the bodies. Thus, they can't return them. But again, that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with emotional issues. So, is that something? Do you see the bodies being a sticking point right now?
As you mentioned, there is this ultra right-wing element in Netanyahu's government, beholden to people like Itamar Ben-Gvir. These are the ones who are constantly attacking Palestinian villages on the West Bank, burning their crops, murdering them, uh, ethnically cleansing the Palestinians. This right-wing party is looking for any excuse to torpedo this very delicate peace talk. And they could still yet force Netanyahu to withdraw from the whole treaty, and the whole thing is off. So we have that, the right wing issue of the bodies on the Israeli side. And we just saw in the news in the last couple of days that Hamas, who, according to this 20-point treaty, will have no future role in running Gaza. They are to be decommissioned. Their tunnels are to be destroyed. Their weapons are to be confiscated, which seems to me to be rather unrealistic, considering how deeply baked into Gaza's DNA and fabric of society Hamas is. But Hamas has, far from disarming, we've seen news reports that as soon as the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, pulled out of these rubble areas in southern Gaza, immediately Hamas fighters, thousands of them, swarmed back in. And we've seen images of these Hamas fighters executing 8 members of anti-Hamas tribes or clans. And they've been having gunfights with these clans that Israel supported during the 2-year war. Israel gave these Palestinian clans weapons, and now Hamas is decisively moving against these Palestinian clans that are potentially angling themselves to fight for power now that Hamas has been weakened. Hamas began the war with 30,000 fighters. Now they're down to about 15,000. They're weak, but they're moving to re-exert their authority in post-peace treaty Gaza.
And it should be noted too that Trump today said if the internal bloodshed continues, then the U.S., or he didn't say the U.S., but as he put it, they would have to go in to finish them off. They being the operative word there. As you said, earlier, it's not expected to be a U.S. force, but that is something that's on the table. I think it's interesting to go back to when you and I first started talking about this, that the Palestinians aren't big fans of Hamas either. You had talked about that earlier, that Hamas kind of went in and took over sort of the government of Palestine, and the Palestinian people are not necessarily Hamas.
Yeah, that's correct. I think Hamas won the elections back in 2006, and in 2007, they took over Gaza. Now, people who voted for Hamas certainly weren't voting for this sort of action that we saw on October 7th that would lead to the retaliatory obliteration of their world. People who voted for Hamas when they took power from the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, back in 2006, 2007, those people were doing a protest vote against corruption by the Palestinian Authority. And we've seen Hamas's popularity dwindle over the years as they have continued to attack Israel. And this always ignites massive, devastating responses against the people of Gaza who pay the price for these Hamas terrorists goading and attacking Israel. We saw on October 7th, there were some people in Gaza, Palestinians, who celebrated the raid, this bestial raid where these Hamas fighters broke over the wall and went into these communities around Gaza and massacred 1,200 people. But the retaliation was swift and overwhelming and devastating. And the Hamas fighters went down into their labyrinth of underground tunnels. They call it the Gaza Metro. And these Hamas fighters who ignited this response were safe from these bombardments that obliterated and almost nuked, almost like Hiroshima or Nagasaki, rubblized the buildings above ground. And we've seen as many as 55,000 Palestinian civilians killed as a result of Hamas's strike into Israel. So certainly polls now show for the first time this war fatigue and disgust with the Palestinian Hamas group has infuriated and begun an anti-Hamas movement among the long-suffering people of Hamas. I'm sorry, the long-suffering people of the Gaza Strip.
What's interesting too is we were talking about isolationism with Israel, but I'm wondering if Hamas was looking at some isolationism too, because Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, these are countries that weren't involved, and now they were part of the group that said this has got to end now. Muslim countries.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, Jim, Hamas's two most outspoken overseas sponsors in the Sunni Muslim world were Turkey and Qatar. Of course, Iran provided them with weapons, but Iran got neutralized by the events this summer when Israel went in there during Operation Rising Lion and destroyed their air defenses, and America took out weakened their nuclear facilities at places like Isfahan and Natanz. So Iran's gone, and we saw that Turkey and Qatar got tired of Hamas's intransigence, Hamas's belligerence. They supported Hamas only up to a certain measure when the Turkish leader Erdogan finally said enough is enough. We need to think about a narrative for the Gaza Strip that isn't all about destroying the Zionist entity, Israel, and is about ending the Hamas charter call for the destruction of Israel and thinking about a future where the Palestinians can live in peace and have, their own homeland, self-determination and honor, and live in peace and give Israel peace as well. So I think war fatigue hit not just the people living under that rain of Israeli artillery shells and bombardments, but it hit Hamas's main overseas supporters, Turkey and Qatar. And they worked in concert with the Egyptians to support Trump in his call for this ceasefire. So I think it's a historic moment. Trump deserves credit for it. But I also think the Egyptians and the Turkish and the Qataris deserve credit for bringing Hamas to the peace table and making this possible.
I can't help but think too that I think back to the Camp David peace accords. That deal is still in place to this day. That was signed by Jimmy Carter with President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin. It's still in place now.
Yep.
Peace can work.
Yeah, that peace treaty, the Camp David peace accords that you mentioned, were historic. They were groundbreaking. They were bigger than this because what President Jimmy Carter did back in 1979 for the Camp David peace accords was he brought together Begin, as you mentioned, the Prime Minister of Britain, with Sadat, the President of Egypt. And Egypt was the most powerful Arab Muslim country that was fighting in these wars against Israel. In the 1948 war with Israel, the 1967 war with Israel, the 1973 Yom Kippur war with Israel. Egypt was always the most powerful factor in the Arab alliance that sought to destroy Israel and push it into the Mediterranean and wipe it out as a nation. But Jimmy Carter had the farsightedness to bring the quarreling leader of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, with Menachem Begin from Israel, and sit them down in the Camp David agreements and the peace accords and bring peace between Egypt and Israel. And there has been, as you mentioned, no wars between Israel and any Arab state since the 1979 Camp David peace accords. I hope, fingers crossed, that this peace accord signed last week and ratified at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, I hope that this will do the same thing, that it will bury the hatchet and bring a modicum of peace between Israel and the Palestinians. But key to this is giving Israel security guarantees that it needs, that it won't have another one of these brutal, bestial, barbaric raids like we saw in that Al-Aqsa flood invasion, as
Yeah.
Hamas called it, on October 7th. And most importantly, and more vexing, we need to have the Palestinians given the one thing they want the most, their own homeland in the rump territory that was left to them after their defeat in 1948 and 1967. You need to give them freedom and self-determination and give them the ability to live in peace in their own homeland.
And that's part of the
Unless you do
deal.
this,
And that's
yeah,
part of the deal is
exactly
the recognition of a Palestinian statehood. I mean,
right.
it's clearly in one of the 20 points.
Yep. In fact, the points in Trump's plan is point number 19. And by the way, I must applaud Donald Trump and his team for the lofty, almost Wilsonian rhetoric they use in point 19. Point 19 is fundamental. It says that the Palestinians will be given the right to self-determination, to have their own state, and to be able to live with this aspiration that has always been their hope and dream of living under their own government with honor and dignity of their own nation state.
We've got about 6 minutes left here, but I wanted to touch base on the other topic that you and I have been talking about for almost 3 years now, coming up on 3 years, and that's the war in Ukraine. The president has said that he will meet with President Putin. There's no timetable yet. I guess it's in Budapest right now that it's sort of tentatively scheduled. And the president is weighing whether to give Ukraine Tomahawk missiles right now for their defense. Where do you see we stand with that conflict, that war right now?
Trump has proven to be far less agile and aggressive in dealing with the Russian quote unquote friend, we call his friend, former KGB operative Vladimir Putin. We saw that Trump was willing to leverage his power to push Netanyahu to make sacrifices and come to the peace table and make peace with Hamas. But we've seen that Trump has this almost adulation, this admiration for Putin. We saw him arrange to have Putin come out of the cold and fly to Alaska this summer and meet with Trump with all the fanfare of a red carpet and everything. And they meet in Alaska, and Trump takes this guy, Putin, who's a war criminal. He's wanted by the International War Criminal Tribunal for war crimes, and take this guy who can't even visit another country who'll be arrested, and allow Putin to come on American soil and feted him with all this honor. And Putin flew off and gave Trump absolutely nothing. Just like just like Trump's attempts to get peace with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, he met this dictator and got nothing for it because Trump has been unwilling to use the stick when it comes to forcing peace with Israel.
But
Forcing
his
peace
tone,
between Ukraine and Russia.
his tone has changed though too, because now he said, and last month I know that he said that he feels used by Putin. He has said that at one of the press conferences that he's really not getting anything from Putin. He did say late last month, that he felt that Ukraine could still win the war and get back all its land that was taken. So, and Zelensky feels that now Trump is listening to him and the needs there, and so do the Europeans. They feel like the U.S. has gone back into their corner now.
Well, it's just interesting. Recall, if you will, January, February, March, April of this year of Trump's presidency, his rhetoric was anti-Ukraine. He was blaming the Ukrainians for having their cities wiped out and their people slaughtered and their women raped and their country facing conquest by an anti-democratic authoritarian regime. He was blaming the victims. Who can forget that horrific scene when Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, came to the White House to visit J.D. Vance and Trump, and they ambushed him and attacked him and humiliated him in the White House. This, I think, reflected Trump's admiration for the anti-democracy thug that is Putin and his contempt for Zelensky for standing up for democracy and being basically a Winston Churchill for his Ukrainian people. But slowly, over April and May, Trump's tone, as you mentioned, began to change. Zelensky had a meeting one-on-one with Trump in the Vatican, and that sort of thawed the ice. And slowly, I think Trump came to the conclusion he can't win the Nobel Prize unless he brings peace to Ukraine and Russia. And he can't do this by constantly attacking the Ukrainians and blaming them for being invaded by Russia. He needs to be even-handed and try making both sides come and meet at the middle. And
My
slowly, you're
understanding,
right.
my understanding too is the first lady has been certainly whispering in his ear that it will, the children that have been taken and what have you, um, he needs to do something, meaning the president needs to do something.
Right. Well, you mentioned that Trump had said he'd been being used by Putin. He'd been strung along by Putin. And Putin was using Trump's ego, having these meetings, blowing his ego, and Trump was getting absolutely nothing for it. And you're right. It was his wife, Melania Trump, who herself comes from an ex-communist East European background. And she sat down with her husband, Trump, and said, Putin is a war criminal. Putin has been literally having his people steal thousands of children from Ukraine and kidnap them. And that's why Putin is wanted by the war crimes tribunal. So Melania Trump was influential in pointing out the obvious that we all see with our eyes is that Putin is the aggressor. Putin has slaughtered thousands of people in their own country who are just fighting to pass on democracy to a new generation. And I think Trump slowly began to harden his position against the man who he called a genius for invading Ukraine, that is Vladimir Putin. And we'll see if he's willing to Trump is finally willing to leverage his authority and threaten Putin with the issue of these Tomahawk cruise missiles, which would be tremendously effective in allowing the Ukrainians to strike rear area staging grounds for Russia across the border, deep inside of surrounding territories. I think Trump should have been more aggressive and firmer with Putin all along, and that he should have threatened to use the stick, in this case, the Tomahawk cruise missiles, instead of just the carrot of basically sucking up to Putin and getting nothing for it.
Well, we're going to have to leave it at that. Lots of stuff to go through, and I have a feeling we're going to be talking to you in the not too distant future too. So stand by your email. I'm sure we'll be talking to you. Brian Glynn Williams, who's been with us for the past 3 years, keeping us updated on these things. It's great seeing you as always, and thanks for doing the show with us.
My pleasure. I look forward to chatting with you next time, Jim. Take care.
That's going to do it for this edition of A Conversation With. I'm Jim Marshall of the New Bedford Cable Network. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you again soon.